Thanks all. I think that we all know what we're talking about because there's been enough of it in the news recently. They're mostly protesters, mostly people from Just Stop Oil and not so much Extinction Rebellion, but a new bunch as well. Another gang has cropped up called Youth Demand, who seem even more idiotic than Just Stop Oil somehow. I don't know how that's possible, but we've noticed that, and they're doing things which aren't new, because the act of going into public galleries, public museums, and essentially seizing that space as a platform to pursue or impose or demand a certain set of policy changes, insist on this or that campaign or political outcome when it comes to, say, ceasing the oil company sponsorship of museums, demanding then that was what Liberate Tate was all about, if you remember them, maybe in the 2010s. Going on to the more recent protests, which are essentially about seizing the platform of the status and the visibility of art galleries, and of course using social media effectively to broadcast these interventions which are making demands of our entire society. Just Stop Oil insists that what we must absolutely do is stop drilling for gas and oil right away, and to hell with the consequences. Even more egregiously, Youth Demand recently tacked on, as seems to be the case now with a lot of these kind of boycott and kind of protest interventions about kind of very current causes. They went in and tacked on the idea of protesting about the war in Gaza, and basically protest against Israel's war in Gaza by essentially papering over a poster of a painting by Picasso of mother and child with a poster of a mother and child photograph taken in the conflict. So we seem to be surrounded by a generation or a certain kind of group of people, a certain tendency that thinks quite easily about attacking or staging protests on in and on artworks in museums. And obviously it's entirely to do with the fact that a lot of these protesters recognize the culture, the status and the cultural status and the power and significance that we as a society, as a culture, give to artworks and museums. That we know there's a reason that museums are important, we think. We think that museums and the artworks they contain are important because they say something about us and about what we value in society. And so the protests target these venues opportunistically, I think, because they want to claim the prestige, the value, and they want to, in a certain way, affront the value that we hold for these things. They want to claim the value that we hold for artworks in museums and say, well, actually, you know what, you think this is valuable, well, actually, it's not as important as this bigger issue that I'm going to insist you listen to me about. Now, of course, in a way, artwork iconoclasm, this is going to be a great word to tongue twist throughout the session. Historically, we know there's plenty, it's gone on long before these recent protests. Real iconoclasm, though, in the meaning of the term, goes back to religious iconoclasm, the destruction of artworks. But it's really about, and this is the kind of point I want to develop in these notes, religious iconoclasm that goes back to, say, the religious wars in Europe during the Reformation and others, or for example, take a more recent example, the fall of the Soviet Union, where everybody decided to tear down all the detested statues of Lenin and Stalin and whatnot, and then essentially not know where to put them, so they parked them all in great big statue cemeteries, which were always very interesting in the 90s. But that historical iconoclasm was always about deposing the old order. I mean, if you think also about ISIS and its destruction of archaeological artifacts, the Bamiyan statues, for example, when they were in control. It's always their regressive and backward, medievalism harks back to that intolerance for old orders. Of course, there have been more enlightened revolutionary movements that do recognize or have recognized the value of retaining artifacts of the Ancien Régime or the Old Order, even in the moment of their victory. The French Revolution, for example, quickly established the Louvre to house the former collections that belonged of the artworks that belonged to the monarchy, the French monarchy. And of course, there's an interesting point that we have to kind of deal with, which is that there are famous precedents when it comes to attacking paintings. I think our paintings are getting a bit fed up of being attacked, to be honest. But the parallel that JSO and XR and many of these kind of people make is, well, hey, look at the suffragettes. There's a long tradition of radical protest in Britain that attacks artwork in the name of a greater good. And I always find that a really kind of outrageous parallel, because it's worth remembering that the suffragettes have been peacefully campaigning for democratic rights for decades, right? And they enlisted huge numbers of British people in their cause, right? And many people agreed with them. And the reason that they ended up with direct action was because Parliament, men, and the establishment, political establishment, simply refused to budge on the issue of women's suffrage, to the point where they took more drastic measures simply for the good reason that they had no other recourse. So I think we have to kind of separate that out a little bit, and certainly call out those activists when they, I think, dishonour the name of the suffragettes on precisely on that point. They have democratic means available to make their points. They do not bring many thousands or millions of their fellow Brits along with them with regard to their agenda. But I think it's important then to grasp, I think that today's artwork smashers are neither a popular uprising nor a disenfranchised part of the society. I think rather they tend to represent vocal minorities, yes, but those vocal minorities happen to represent influential sections of society whose agendas are those shared by the political and cultural establishment, and who act in a rather more peculiar way as a sort of activist moral police, demonstrating by their actions the moral superiority of their cause over even the respect for public institutions or the works entrusted to those institutions. It's important then to grasp the connection between iconoclastic, so-called iconoclastic activists and the institutions they address. It's not as if today's museums and galleries are holdout bastions of conservative, nationalist and imperialist thinking, far from it. Rather, today's museums and galleries are run by people who largely agree with the iconoclasts and in their own way are more interested in demoting or re-evaluating or reinterpreting the contents of museums and the roles of their institutions to align with the orthodoxies of the day, rather than to make the case. So those institutions, I think, nowadays really don't want to make the case for why they are good institutions or why what they do in terms of looking after and presenting artworks are good. They don't make those institutions, say, like the Tate or others, don't make the case for what makes art good, nor do they try to champion the public virtue of an institution that offers an understanding of artworks, of the historical context of artworks, or the story of art in our country. So, I mean, there's quite a lot to talk about later. But I'm going to skip to a conclusion here, which is that this is, I think, at the moment we're living through, in a very real sense, a kind of regime change. The shift from the Ancien Régime, but we'll work out what it is, to something which I don't think I agree with. But it's not a regime change led from the bottom, so it's not an iconoclastic attack from a mass popular uprising against a hated despotic order. It's not coming from the mass of society. It's the regime change of the political and cultural elite, which has been going on for decades, but now, and we only just seem to be noticing it now, has made its way through British society and is now in the process of rewriting our everyday culture and the culture of our institutions. We shouldn't forget that as old icons are smashed, the new cultural elite also replaces the old stuff with its own iconography. Think of the Mayor of London. I mean, I really don't want to live in London anymore. I mean, luckily I don't, but coming back here, it really depresses me. Think of the Mayor of London's naming of streets, the renaming of all the overground lines, to make us feel a bit better somehow. Recently the commissioning of a new monumental sculpture to commemorate the victims of the Atlantic slave trade, announced in September. Of course, there is already a monument to the abolition of the slave trade in the City of London, but everybody's forgotten about it. The cultural elite that now runs our museums and galleries isn't that interested in the art in their care, or explaining the history of art in an objective and dispassionate way. And in particular, they don't really have any interest in the artistic values and qualities of the works in their care. They are more interested in the museum as an instrument of propaganda. And when you look, just to conclude, when you look at the agendas that the protesters are turning up to protest, particularly with regards to climate change, but it does extend towards things like, say, or sponsorship in general, but of particular kinds of companies, and perhaps not so much Israel-Gaza just yet. But when you see the claims that those protesters are making, they are essentially the agendas of the museums. Look at any professional organisation of the museum sector in Britain, and on their front pages, the National Museums Directors Association, the Museums Association, and so on, it is all anti-racism, climate change, and diversity, right? These are not iconoclastic or radical uprisings. They are to put it in a hyperbolic way, these protesters are the cultural militant guard or the cultural activist police that project the interests of the cultural elite on everybody else.
Thanks. Thank you, Jojo. Thank you.